Imagine being the perfect husband, loving, caring, and loyal. Now, picture the shocking truth that turns everything upside down. This isn't just any crime. It's a twisted web of lies, betrayal, and a chilling revelation. What if the victim was never really the victim at all? Stay tuned as we dive deep into the haunting story of a husband who played the grieving spouse, only to reveal himself as the true killer. You won't believe the shocking truth until the very end. He sat there, a figure of grief, eyes red and swollen. His hands shook as he clutched the cold coffee mug. The room was dim, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound. The house was eerily quiet. His wife, Sarah, was gone, vanished in the night. The police were questioning him, eyes narrow with suspicion, but he was calm.
Too calm.
His voice was steady, as if rehearsed. I don't know what happened. I woke up, she was gone. His story never wavered, his words clear and composed. They told him they'd find her, that they'd search every inch. But they never knew, never suspected. He was the one who had planned it, the one who had turned their perfect life into a nightmare. The moments leading up to her disappearance were blurred, lost in the haze of his mind. But he knew the exact moment he had sealed her fate. It was late, the clock nearing midnight. She was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through a magazine. The dim light from the lamp cast long shadows across the room. He approached her quietly, his footsteps masked by the sound of the rain outside. The knife felt heavy in his hand, cold against his skin. The air was thick, heavy with tension. She never saw it coming. One swift motion, a sharp scream cut through the silence. But only for a moment. The kitchen grew quiet again. Her body slumped to the floor, lifeless. He had done it. But the hardest part was yet to come. He cleaned up quickly, methodically. He wiped down every surface, making sure no trace was left behind. Then he staged the scene, creating the perfect illusion of a disappearance. The phone had been left on the counter, her purse still hanging by the door, as if she had just walked out. Her shoes were placed neatly by the hallway. It was perfect. No one would suspect him. But as the days passed, the guilt began to gnaw at him. It wasn't the fear of getting caught. It was the constant reminder that he had taken a life. But it was too late to turn back now. The police continued to search. He continued to play the grieving husband. But inside, something shifted. His heart had stopped beating for her. The house felt colder, emptier.
He was alone now.
But he didn't care. All he could hear was the sound of his own breathing. The moment he realized, deep down, he didn't regret what he had done. That was when the real horror began. The days dragged on, each one blending into the next. The search for Sarah seemed endless, but still, no trace of her. He played his part well. A worried husband, pacing the living room, answering calls from concerned friends. But there was something hollow in his eyes. Something empty that no one could see. The neighbors whispered behind closed doors, but he didn't care. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know that he was the one who had shattered their perfect life. The house that once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a prison. He couldn't escape the memories. The sound of Sarah's last breath echoed in his mind, over and over. It haunted him, but not in the way he had feared. He didn't fear being caught. No, it was something darker. Something that stirred deep within him. The thrill of getting away with it. The power. He had controlled it all. He had controlled her life, her death, and now the story of her disappearance. No one could touch him. But the cracks started to show. The police were starting to get closer. Small details didn't add up. The way Sarah had vanished. No struggle. No signs of a break-in. They started to question him more aggressively. At first, he kept his cool. He smiled when they asked the same questions, over and over. But inside, something was shifting. The walls were closing in. He couldn't hold the act together much longer. Each interrogation left him a little more drained, a little more desperate to keep up the facade. And then came the breakthrough. A neighbor had found something, a small scrap of cloth caught on the fence. It was from Sarah's dress. The police showed up at his door one evening, their eyes cold and sharp. He tried to act surprised, like he had no idea what they were talking about. But they had him now. The evidence had mounted. His lies were starting to unravel. They found the bloodstains in the kitchen. They found the blade he had used hidden in the garage. And with that, the truth came crashing down. The perfect illusion he had created shattered. He sat there, his hands trembling, as the detective read him his rights. His heart raced, but not with fear. No, it was something else. A sick satisfaction. He had played them all. He had been the victim. But now, the game was over. And in the silence that followed, he finally understood. There was no escape from the darkness that had taken root inside him. The cold metal of the handcuffs pressed into his wrists, sharp and unyielding. He felt the weight of them, but it wasn't the physical pain that gnawed at him. It was the crushing realization that the freedom he had so carefully built was slipping away. The walls of the interrogation room closed in tighter with every passing second. Outside, the world was still moving. People were still living their lives. But inside, he was trapped in the aftermath of his own choices. The detective stood over him, watching silently, waiting. The silence in the room was deafening. And for a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel the weight of it all. The years of pretending, of lying, of controlling everything. The life he had stolen from Sarah, gone. And now he was the one facing the consequences. The door to the room opened with a soft creak. 2 officers entered, their eyes unreadable. They stood there, watching him, as if they had already decided his fate. They weren't looking for answers anymore. They were waiting for the confession. He sat in the chair, his mind spinning. His thoughts were a jumble, memories rushing in like a flood. He remembered her face, her smile. He remembered the warmth of her touch, the way she used to laugh at his jokes.
But none of it mattered now.
None of it changed the truth. The lies had caught up with him, and there was nowhere left to run. "Why did you do it?" the detective finally asked, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, almost clinical, but there was something in his eyes, something that made the room feel colder. For a long moment, he didn't answer. He couldn't. Words felt useless now. What could he say to explain what he had done? The truth seemed so simple, so horrifying, that he couldn't bring himself to speak it aloud. "I loved her," he finally whispered, the words coming out hollow, detached. The detective didn't react. He just nodded, as if he had heard it all before. And then, with a final glance, they left the room. Alone again, he leaned back in his chair, staring blankly at the ceiling. His mind replayed the events over and over. The knife, the silence, her last breath, and now the end. There would be no more pretending. No more acting the part of the grieving husband. The truth had finally caught up to him, and as the realization settled in, he could feel something else stir beneath the surface. A strange, quiet peace. It was over. The hours passed, dragging on with an unbearable slowness. The fluorescent lights flickered above him, their hum filling the silence. He stared at the cracked ceiling, lost in thought, but no longer overwhelmed by guilt or fear. Instead, a numbness had settled over him. It was as though the weight of everything, the murder, the lies, the inevitable capture, had finally sunk in, and he no longer cared. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. The door to the interrogation room creaked open again, and this time, the officer wasn't alone. The detective returned, flanked by another officer. They sat down across from him, their eyes cold and steady. It was clear that this time, they weren't expecting answers. They already knew everything. They just needed him to admit it. The air between them felt thick, suffocating, as they stared at him in silence. He could feel their gaze boring into him, waiting for him to crack. But he didn't. His mind was a blank slate, his emotions hollow. Finally, the detective leaned forward. "We know what happened. We know you killed her," he said, his voice low and firm. He didn't flinch. The words didn't sting like they should have. Instead, they felt like an inevitable truth, like something he had known all along. "I didn't mean to," he said quietly, almost as if he were speaking to himself. The words escaped before he could stop them. "I never wanted to hurt her." There was a long pause, and for a moment, the detective studied him, eyes narrowing. "Then why?" The question hung in the air, sharp and pointed. His chest tightened. He didn't want to think about it, didn't want to confront the twisted reason that had driven him. But the truth wouldn't let him hide anymore. "She was always in control," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "She had to be in control. Everything. Her life, our life, even me. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't stand being her shadow." He paused, swallowing hard. "Her perfect little husband. I was never good enough. I thought if I could just make her disappear, if I could just take away her control, maybe then I'd finally be free." The room was silent. The detective didn't speak, but his expression softened, almost imperceptibly. They didn't need his confession. They had the evidence, the blood, the witness reports. But now they had something deeper, something darker. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just about getting away with murder. It had always been about breaking free from her, from the life they had built together, the life that had suffocated him for so long. And now, in this sterile, dimly lit room, the last piece of his twisted puzzle had fallen into place. He wasn't the victim. He never had been. He had been the killer all along. The detective sat back in his chair, staring at him with an unreadable expression. The silence between them was heavy, suffocating. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, loud and frantic, as the words hung in the air. For a moment, he almost expected to feel some sort of relief, some release. But instead, there was only an empty void. Nothing changed. The world outside the walls of the interrogation room was still moving, still unaware of what had transpired. It was like the truth had been too much to bear. He looked at the detective's face, searching for something, some shred of understanding, some trace of compassion. But there was nothing. Only cold professionalism. "I think you've had enough," the detective finally said, his voice breaking the silence. The words were not comforting. They didn't offer any sense of closure. Instead, they felt like the final nail in the coffin. The last step in a journey he couldn't undo. They rose from their seats and left the room without another word, the door slamming shut behind them. He was left alone once more, the stillness pressing in on him from all sides. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to hide. But in the silence, he finally understood something that had eluded him for so long. It wasn't just the act of murder that had destroyed everything. It was the fact that, in the end, he had only ever been playing a part. He had spent so long pretending to be the victim, pretending to be the one trapped in a life that didn't fit him, that he had lost himself. Lost in the web of his own lies. The cell door creaked open again, and a prison guard entered, his face emotionless. "Time's up," he said simply. He rose to his feet, the weight of the handcuffs heavy on his wrists, and followed the guard down the narrow hallway. Every step felt like it was carrying him farther away from the life he had known, from the twisted game he had played so well. The door to the holding area closed behind him with a cold, metallic clang. And as the lock clicked into place, he realized that this was it. This was his new reality. The final consequence of his choices. In the dark, empty cell, he sat on the cold concrete bench and closed his eyes. There was no comfort in the quiet now. Just the crushing weight of his actions, the finality of it all. And as he allowed the thoughts to swirl in his mind, he felt something stir, something deep inside of him. A flicker of the old thrill, the cold satisfaction, the power. It was the only thing that had ever truly been his. The cell was small, barely enough space to stretch out fully. The bare walls, the flickering light overhead, and the silence that surrounded him, it was suffocating, a constant reminder of his new life. But even in the stillness, his mind raced. Thoughts flashed by like rapid fire, images of Sarah, the night in the kitchen, the blood that had stained his hands. It was a nightmare that wouldn't let him wake up. He had done it. He had taken her life. And now, here he was alone in a prison cell. But there was something else there too, something unsettling. A gnawing sense that even though he was caught, even though his freedom had been stolen, he was still in control, still playing the game. He thought of the moment when the detective had leaned forward, his words so sharp, so final. "We know you did it." And for the first time, he hadn't flinched. He had felt almost detached, as if the reality of it all had become someone else's story, someone else's nightmare. That's what had always fascinated him, how easy it was to disappear into the role of the victim, to let everyone else carry the burden of your actions while you remain the innocent one. He had convinced himself of it, over and over again. Even now, in the solitude of his cell, the lie still lingered. He had never been the one at fault. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening as his thoughts spiraled. A sound broke through his racing mind, the soft shuffle of feet outside his cell. He blinked, returning to reality, and saw a figure standing at the bars. Another inmate. His eyes gleamed with curiosity, but there was something darker lurking beneath the surface. "New guy?" the inmate asked, his voice low, almost friendly. He didn't answer immediately. For a moment, it felt like the entire world had paused, just for him. His gaze met the other man's, but there was no pity, no judgment in those eyes, just a cold, calculating interest. It was the same look he had worn when he had watched Sarah's last breath slip away, the same look that had made him feel powerful. "Yeah," he finally said, his voice soft. The other inmate's lips twitched into a smile, something feral in the expression. "Don't get too comfortable," the man said. "You might be the new one now, but trust me, this place has a way of breaking people. It'll strip everything away, leave you with nothing but who you really are." His words were a warning, but there was no fear in them, no urgency, just the calm knowledge of someone who had lived through it all. The cell felt smaller now, the air even thicker. For a moment, he considered the man's words, a twinge of unease worming its way into his chest. But then he dismissed it. "Who I really am," he thought. He already knew. He had known it all along. The door to his cell closed with a metallic clink, and the silence rushed back in. His thoughts were louder now, echoing in his skull. The power. It wasn't over. Not yet. Maybe the world outside had turned its back on him, but inside these walls, inside his mind, he was still the one in control. And that, he realized, was the only thing that mattered. Days blended into nights. The sounds of the prison became a constant backdrop, the rattling of chains, the murmurs of other inmates, the distant clanging of doors. He had settled into a rhythm, a routine that felt almost comforting in its predictability. But as the days passed, the initial thrill of control began to fade. The emptiness that had once been manageable now felt like a weight pressing down on him.
It was a different kind of silence now.
The kind that seeps into your bones and stays there, echoing long after the noise has stopped. He spent his time mostly alone in his cell, his thoughts circling back to Sarah. To the night.
To the moment it had all changed.
He could still see her face, pale and lifeless, her eyes wide open, staring at nothing. He had felt something in that moment, something he couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't just satisfaction. It was something darker, deeper. It was the feeling of being free. But now, as the days wore on, that freedom had turned into a cage of its own. The power that had once thrilled him now felt like a hollow victory, one that had cost him everything. The weight of his actions pressed in on him from all sides. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her again. He saw the blood on his hands, the blood that wouldn't wash away. The constant reminder that he was the one who had ended it all. The one who had shattered everything. And then came the whispers. It started small, barely a murmur, but it grew louder with each passing day. Inmates who had heard the stories, who had pieced together the fragments of his past. It didn't take long for them to figure out who he was, the man who had killed his wife. The whispers followed him everywhere, like a shadow. He could feel their eyes on him when he walked through the yard, could hear the snickers when he sat alone in the dining hall. At first, he tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself that it didn't matter. But the more they spoke, the more he began to question whether he could keep up the act. The victim, the grieving husband, the man who had lost everything. But he wasn't that man anymore. He had already confessed, had already shown them the truth. Now, in the depths of his solitude, he had to confront something else, the darkness that had always been inside of him, the darkness that had led him to do what he did. And in that darkness, he saw something that scared him more than the walls of the prison. He saw himself, the man who had chosen to end it all, the man who had taken control, who had killed, and who had been able to live with it. The sound of footsteps approaching his cell snapped him back to reality. It was the same inmate who had spoken to him earlier. He stopped just outside the bars, his eyes glinting with something dangerous. "You're a killer," the man said, his voice low and taunting. The words hung in the air, but this time, they didn't sting. He wasn't afraid. Not anymore. "I'm more than that," he replied, his voice flat. The man smirked, his expression unreadable. "You'll see," he said cryptically before turning and walking away. As the footsteps faded, a strange feeling began to stir inside him. More than that. He wondered if he had even begun to understand who he truly was. The realization hit him like a blow to the gut. In this place, in the darkness of his own mind, he wasn't just a killer. He was something worse. Something he couldn't escape. Not ever. The days stretched on, each one dragging like the last, but something had changed within him. The cold numbness had settled deep into his chest, but now it was accompanied by a gnawing awareness, a sense that his prison wasn't just the physical walls around him, it was himself. His thoughts, once sharp and deliberate, now felt like a weight that bore down on him, suffocating him from within. The whispers among the other inmates grew louder, more frequent. They spoke of him in hushed tones, their eyes following him wherever he went. He could hear the words "killer" muttered when he passed, could feel the weight of their judgment pressing on him like 1,000 hands. But it didn't matter. Not really. He had known, deep down, that this was the price he would pay. The cost of freedom. The cost of the darkness he had embraced. His cell felt colder now, even in the midst of the prison's heat. The stillness pressed in on him, the quiet deafening in its intensity. The flickering light overhead cast long shadows on the walls, stretching like fingers across the floor. He stared at the ceiling, lost in thought, but now, for the first time in weeks, he couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. He wasn't just trapped by the walls of the prison. He was trapped by his own mind. It wasn't the guilt, not exactly. It wasn't the fear of being caught. It was the realization that he had done this to himself. That in choosing to kill Sarah, he had built this cage around himself. And the more he thought about it, the more the truth sank in. There was no escape. He had hoped that the darkness would set him free. That taking control would release him from the suffocating life he had lived with her. But now he saw it for what it was. It wasn't freedom. It was a prison of his own making. The walls of his cell were no longer just bricks and mortar. They were the walls of his own mind. And in the silence, in the stillness, he heard the voice inside him, louder than ever before. The voice that had whispered, "You're free now." But it wasn't true. He wasn't free. He had destroyed the only thing that had kept him tethered to reality. And now he was alone. Truly alone. The sound of the cell door creaking open snapped him from his thoughts. He looked up, expecting the guard or another officer, but instead, the same inmate from before stood at the bars, his eyes gleaming with something dark. "You all right?" the man asked, his voice carrying an edge of mockery. He didn't answer immediately. What was there to say? The man stepped closer, his grin widening. "You've got that look," he said, his voice low. "The look of someone who realizes they're never getting out. Never really leaving." His words cut through him, sharper than any blade. Because it was true. The realization hit him with a jolt. This was it.
This was his life now.
The killer. The man who had shattered everything, and in doing so, had shattered himself. There was no escape from that. He had built this prison, brick by brick, with every choice he had made. And now, as the man turned and walked away, he felt it. The weight of it all. The knowledge that no matter how hard he tried, no matter what he did, he could never undo what had been done. Not in the eyes of the world. And not in his own mind. And with that thought, the darkness closed in tighter. His mind was his cell, and there would be no escape. The days bled together, indistinguishable from one another. His cell became his world, the gray walls closing in like a tomb. Each moment felt suffocating, as if the very air he breathed was thick with the weight of his choices. Every sound, every flicker of light, reminded him of the price he had paid. It had been months since his arrival, but it felt like a lifetime. And still, he couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on him. The whispers hadn't stopped. They followed him everywhere, even in the quiet moments when he was alone in his cell, when he was lost in his thoughts. He's the one who killed his wife, the perfect husband, until the truth came out. He could hear it all, every word, every taunt, each one a reminder of the nightmare he had created for himself. But they didn't know. None of them understood. They didn't understand what it was like to be trapped inside your own mind, to carry a secret so dark, so heavy, that even your own reflections seemed like a lie. It wasn't just the murder that haunted him. It was the way he had twisted himself into believing it was justified, that he had been the victim, that he had no choice. The truth, though, gnawed at him like a relentless force. He had killed her, because he had been too weak to walk away, too weak to admit that he had wanted something different. And in that moment, as the walls of his prison seemed to close in tighter, he felt the weight of his own weakness. But it wasn't just guilt, not exactly. It was the realization that he could never escape it. The horror, the disgust, it was all inside him, buried deep. And no matter how hard he tried, he could never undo it. The door to his cell opened again, and a guard stepped inside, his footsteps loud against the silence. "Get up," the guard said, his tone emotionless. He didn't question it. There was nothing to question anymore. He rose to his feet slowly, the cold concrete beneath him grounding him in the reality of his existence. The guard motioned for him to follow, and he did, without a word. They walked down the narrow hallway, passing by other cells, the eyes of the inmates following him like vultures, hungry and eager for a story. He had become a spectacle, a lesson in failure, in the price of lies. The guard stopped in front of a door and unlocked it, ushering him inside. This wasn't the usual routine. His stomach twisted with unease. As he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him. It wasn't a room. It was a small, dimly lit interrogation chamber. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure if it was fear or something else, but it settled deep in his chest, a tight knot. Across from him, sitting at a table, was the detective who had interrogated him the first time, the one who had watched him fall apart under the pressure of the truth. The same man who had seen through his lies. "Sit down," the detective said, his voice calm, measured. He obeyed. His hands were cold, clammy, but he didn't show it. The detective studied him for a long moment, his gaze piercing. "You know why you're here," the detective finally said. He nodded, though he didn't fully understand. Something in the man's tone told him this wasn't about his case anymore. "No," the detective continued, leaning forward slightly. "You're not just here because of what you did. You're here because of what you've become. The killer. The liar. The man who thought he could escape it all." The words stung, each one cutting through him like a blade. And in that moment he realized something. He would never escape it. No matter how far he ran, no matter how many walls he built, the truth would always find him. It was inescapable. It was part of him. The detective's eyes locked onto his, unblinking. "You've been running from yourself. But I think you know now you can't outrun what's inside." The words hit him like a blow, harder than any punch could. He couldn't outrun it. He couldn't hide from it. And as the detective stood up and walked out of the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts, he understood. The darkness he had embraced had become him. And there was no escape. The door clicked shut behind the detective, and for a long moment, he sat there, alone in the dim room. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, their faint hum the only sound in the otherwise silent chamber. His heart raced, but his mind was numb. The words the detective had spoken echoed in his ears, relentless, unyielding. "You can't outrun what's inside." It was true. He had spent so much time hiding behind the mask of a victim, convincing himself that he had done what he had to do. But now, the mask was gone, and beneath it, there was nothing but the raw, undeniable truth. He had killed her. Not to free himself, not to escape, but because he had wanted it. Because the darkness inside of him had been too much to ignore. His fingers gripped the cold metal of the table in front of him, the sensation grounding him in the reality of what he had done. But even now, even with the full weight of his actions pressing down on him, part of him still clung to the lie. That part of him wanted to scream, "I didn't mean to. She drove me to it." But those words felt hollow, empty. They always had. In the silence, something began to shift inside him. It wasn't guilt, not in the way he had once thought. It wasn't even regret. It was something darker, something far more suffocating. A cold understanding. He had become the thing he had always feared, the monster. The very thing that had driven him to kill in the first place. He wasn't a victim. He never had been. He had been the one pulling the strings all along, weaving the lies, creating the illusion of innocence. The truth had been buried beneath his own deceit, and now it was clawing its way to the surface. For the first time, he didn't feel like a victim. He felt the weight of his own choices. The heaviness of the life he had built, brick by brick, with his own hands. The door to the room opened again, but this time, it wasn't the detective. A new face appeared in the doorway. A young officer, his eyes wary but curious. "Time's up," the officer said, his voice neutral. He didn't move. He stayed seated, his mind too far gone to even register the officer's presence. The officer cleared his throat. "Come on, it's time to go." He still didn't answer. But slowly, he stood up, the weight of his body suddenly feeling like 1,000 pounds. The officer didn't push him, just stood there, watching, waiting. As he walked out of the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was moving through a dream, through a world that had become strangely detached from reality. His steps echoed down the empty corridor, and it felt as though he was walking away from everything he had ever known. But where was he going? The question lingered in his mind, unanswered. He wasn't free. He wasn't a victim. And he had no idea where the rest of his life would lead. But he did know one thing: he would never escape himself. No matter where they took him, no matter how many walls they built around him, he would always carry the truth with him. The truth of who he was. And that was the heaviest prison of all. The hallway felt endless as he walked, each step heavier than the last. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered above him, casting long shadows on the floor. His mind was still reeling, the weight of his own thoughts pressing down with suffocating intensity. The officer beside him said nothing, and neither did he. Neither of them spoke, as if the silence between them was something sacred, something they both understood without words. He was led back to his cell, the familiar door clanging shut behind him with a finality that made his stomach turn. It was the same cell, the same gray walls, the same loneliness. But now, there was something different. The quiet, once a comfort, now felt oppressive. The walls seemed closer, the air thicker, as if the very space was closing in on him. He sat on the narrow cot, staring at the floor. His fingers clenched the thin, worn blanket beneath him, but it did nothing to calm the storm inside his mind. The truth was there, sharp and undeniable, a jagged blade lodged in his chest. He had always been able to pretend, to hide behind the lie of the victim, the grieving husband. But now, in the solitude of his cell, there was no hiding. The mask had cracked, and the face beneath was worse than he could have imagined. The darkness that had once been a whisper inside him was now a loud, ever-present roar. His breath came shallow, the air thick with the weight of it all. The realization that there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. He wasn't the man he had wanted to believe he was. The reflection in the small mirror above the sink confirmed that, eyes hollow, face drawn and tired. There was no trace of the man he had been before. The man who had once convinced himself that he could walk away from everything, that he could control it all. That man was gone, and in his place was something far darker, something he couldn't deny. Something that had always been inside him. Something that had been waiting for the moment to break free. The sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor again. He looked up, but this time, it wasn't the guard. It was someone else, someone he hadn't expected. The detective. The same detective who had been there from the beginning, who had seen through his act, who had laid bare the truth. The detective's eyes were cold, calculating. He studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You've been thinking about it," the detective said, his voice low, almost conversational. He said nothing, but his gaze flicked to the floor, unwilling to meet the detective's eyes. "You've been running from it, but it's never going to go away," the detective continued. "You know that, right?" He didn't respond. What was there to say? The detective stepped closer, his shadow falling across him like a dark cloud. "The truth's not going anywhere," the detective said, his voice a low whisper. "It's already taken root inside you. You can't escape it. Not even here." The words, those simple, brutal words, hit him like a punch to the gut. The truth. The thing he had fought so hard to bury. It was there always. And now, in the stillness of his cell, there was nowhere to run from it. The detective stood there, watching him for a moment longer, as if waiting for something, waiting for a reaction, perhaps. But there was nothing. Nothing left to say. The detective turned and walked away, his footsteps fading as he disappeared down the corridor. He was left alone again, the silence pressing in on him. But it wasn't just the silence anymore. It was the truth. And as it settled around him, heavy and inescapable, he realized one thing. There was no hiding from who he was. Not in this place. Not in this life. And there was no escaping the man he had become. The silence in the cell seemed to stretch for eternity after the detective's departure. The heavy, suffocating quiet hung in the air, thick with the weight of his own thoughts. He tried to breathe, but the air felt dense, every inhalation labored, as if even the atmosphere itself was trying to hold him in place, prevent him from moving forward or escaping. But there was nowhere to go. No one to talk to. No way to bury the truth anymore. He could feel it gnawing at him, digging its claws into his mind, relentless. It didn't matter how many days passed, or how many hours he spent staring at the wall. The truth was always there, staring back at him. The murder. The lies. The blood on his hands. For so long, he had convinced himself that it was a mistake, that he had been justified in what he did. But now, in the crushing silence of his cell, he knew that wasn't true. He had killed her, and there was no getting away from that fact. It was too late for apologies. Too late for redemption. He ran his hand through his hair, feeling the stubble on his chin, the weariness in his bones. It felt like years had passed since that night. Since the moment he had done it, the moment he had taken her life with his own hands. The cold, twisted satisfaction he had once felt had long since faded, leaving only emptiness behind. The reflection in the small mirror above the sink no longer felt like his own. The eyes staring back at him were hollow, lost. There was nothing left of the man who had walked into that house all those months ago, full of promises and hopes. That man had died the moment his hands had wrapped around her neck. He stood up, unsteadily at first, as if the weight of it all was too much to bear. But he had no choice. He had to move. Even if it was just to distract himself from the gnawing truth that was always there, in the background, waiting to tear him apart. He walked over to the small window of his cell, peering out through the bars. The sky was overcast, clouds swirling in a dark mass above. It mirrored the storm inside him, the storm that never seemed to end. But the silence felt more suffocating now, more oppressive than it had ever been before. The truth was like a crushing weight on his chest, slowly pushing the air out of his lungs, and he could feel his heart racing in response. He closed his eyes, as if to block it all out. But it didn't help. The truth was still there. It had always been there, waiting for him to face it. And no matter how hard he tried, no matter how many walls he built, no matter how many lies he told himself, it wouldn't go away. The cells seemed smaller now, the walls pressing in, the cold creeping into his bones. He felt trapped. Trapped in the darkest part of his own mind. The part that had led him to do the unthinkable. The part that would never let him forget. He had thought he could outrun it. But he couldn't. No matter how many days passed, no matter how many times he closed his eyes, the truth was always there, right behind him, closing in like a shadow. He sank back onto the cot, his hands shaking as they gripped the thin blanket. He didn't know what to do anymore. There was no escape from this. There was no going back. And for the first time in his life, he truly understood the horror of what he had become. Not just a killer, but a man broken by his own choices. A man who had built his own prison, brick by brick, and locked himself inside. The shadows in the cell seemed to stretch longer, and for a brief moment, he almost felt like he was suffocating, as though the darkness had come alive, wrapping around him, pulling him deeper into the pit he had created. There was no way out. Not anymore. And all that remained was the cold, unbearable truth that he could never escape. The days dragged on, one indistinguishable from the next, until time itself seemed to lose meaning. The cell had become his world, the walls pressing in, shrinking with each passing hour. But there was something different now. Something deeper. The truth no longer felt like a weight that could be cast aside. It was a part of him. It had soaked into his skin, infiltrated his every thought. And in the darkest moments, it whispered to him, louder than ever before. You can't escape. He no longer questioned his own thoughts. There was no longer a need for denial. He had killed her. The fact sat at the core of his being like a dark anchor, dragging him under the water, suffocating him with its weight. He had convinced himself that he was a victim, that she had pushed him to it. But that was all a lie. And now, with no one to speak the words of comfort, there was no way to shield himself from the truth anymore. There was no one to blame. Just him. Just the man who had murdered his wife in cold blood. The guards, the other inmates, they had all long since given up their pity. They had all heard the stories, the whispers, the rumors of the perfect husband, the one who had played the grieving spouse until his mask had finally cracked. And in the silence of his prison cell, he finally understood why the truth had to come to light. It was his punishment. It was a punishment far worse than anything the prison could ever impose on him. He had become a man consumed by his own darkness. A man who had turned his own life into an inescapable prison. The only thing left was the slow, creeping acceptance of what he had done. But that didn't make it easier. It didn't make the pain go away. The loneliness, the suffocating guilt, these things had taken root inside him, and they would never leave. His hands trembled as he placed them on the edge of his cot, the cold metal of the bars pressing into his skin like a constant reminder. And in that moment he understood. This was it. This was his life now. The killer. The man who had sealed his own fate with his own hands. And no matter how many years passed, no matter how many days he spent in this cell, he would never escape the man he had become. There was no redemption, no forgiveness, only the relentless truth. The months bled into years, and the passage of time seemed to become irrelevant. Each day was a mirror of the last, each hour the same, marked only by the shifting of shadows in his cell. He had learned to move through his life in this place, not out of any desire, but out of sheer necessity. He had grown used to the weight of his own guilt, the oppressive knowledge that he could never undo what he had done. The memories of her, the sound of her voice, the warmth of her smile, were distant now, fading like echoes in the back of his mind. But the memory of her death? That was always present, always fresh, always gnawing at him. He had tried to block it out, to bury it beneath 1,000 layers of silence and self-loathing. But it never worked. The truth never left. Every morning, he woke to face it again, the inescapable reality that he had taken another life. His life, once full of hope, full of promise, had been irreversibly altered in a single, dark moment. He had hoped, no, believed that time would somehow heal him, that the prison would become his redemption. But now, years into his sentence, he knew the bitter truth. There was no redemption. There was no forgiveness. He had created his own hell, one he could never escape from. The walls of the prison had become his sanctuary, not because he was safe, but because they were all that remained. The bars were a cage that kept him locked in, but they also kept the world out. The outside world, what little was left of it, no longer mattered to him. He had no more lies to tell, no more masks to wear. And so, as he sat on his cot, the final understanding settled into him like a weight, a truth too heavy to carry but impossible to cast away. He was a killer. Not the victim, not the innocent. Just the man who had taken a life, and would never be able to take it back. And in the silence of his cell, with only the distant sounds of the prison surrounding him, he finally accepted it. There would be no more running, no more pretending. The truth had won. And in that truth, he found his peace, strange, unsettling peace. For he knew, deep down, that the rest of his days would be spent in the only place where he could truly confront who he had become. A man who had lived a lie, but who, at last, had come to terms with his own dark reality.
The end.